There is a person in your life, maybe at work, maybe in your family, maybe in a room full of people who speaks, and every single head turns. Nobody interrupts them. Nobody checks their phone. Nobody looks away. And you've watched that person your entire life wondering, what do they have that I don't? It's not their looks. It's not their title. It's not even their intelligence. It's something deeper, something almost invisible. And here's the part that should shake you awake right now. You were never taught it. Not in school, not at home, not in any job you've ever had. You were taught what to say. Nobody ever taught you how to say it, so people feel like they have no choice but to listen. That ends today. Because what you're about to hear over the next 2 hours is not a communication tip sheet. This is not a list of tricks you'll forget by Tuesday. What this is a complete rewiring of the way you show up when you open your mouth. By the time this audiobook is finished, you will understand, at a level most people never reach, why some voices carry weight and most don't, and more importantly, you will know exactly what to do about it. Stay with me. In this audiobook, here is exactly what is going to happen. In Chapter 1, you're going to understand why most people, no matter how smart they are, no matter how right they are being unconsciously tuned out, and the science that explains why authority is felt before it is ever heard. In Chapter 2, you'll discover the single most powerful shift in how you carry yourself before you say a single word, because authority doesn't start in your throat. It starts in your body, your breath, and the 3 seconds of silence before you speak. In Chapter 3, you're going to learn how to use your voice as an instrument tone, pace, pitch, pausing, and why the most commanding speakers in American history all use the same hidden rhythms, whether they knew it or not. Chapter 4 breaks down the architecture of authoritative language, the specific words, sentence structures, and framing patterns that make people lean in rather than tune out. In Chapter 5, and this is the one that changes everything you'll learn, the psychology of credibility, why people believe some voices and dismiss others, and the precise psychological triggers that make a listener decide in under 7 seconds whether you're worth listening to. Chapter 6 gives you the authority code for high-stakes situations, the boardroom, the difficult conversation, the job interview, the confrontation you've been avoiding. Chapter 7 is about something nobody talks about: the emotional authority. How to speak in a way that moves people, that doesn't just inform them but activates them. Chapter 8 deals with the situations that destroy your authority without warning: arguments, nerves, interruptions, and the emotional hijacks that make you lose your power mid-sentence. Chapter 9 gives you the long game: how to build a reputation for authority that precedes you into every room before you even arrive. And Chapter 10, the final chapter, is not a summary. It is a challenge, a direct challenge to the version of you that has been playing small with your voice for far too long. Before we go any further, if this audiobook is speaking to something real in you, if you already feel the weight of what we're about to unlock together, hit that subscribe button right now on the Mindset Audiobooks channel, because every week we release audiobooks exactly like this one, built for people who are serious about becoming the best, sharpest, most powerful version of themselves. The library is already waiting for you. Now let's begin. Chapter 1: Why Smart People Get Ignored, the authority gap nobody talks about. There is a moment most people have experienced, but almost nobody talks about honestly. You're in a meeting. You have an idea, a good idea, maybe even the best idea in the room. You say it, and something terrible happens. People nod politely. Maybe someone says, "Interesting," and then the conversation moves on. Nothing sticks, nothing lands. 2 minutes later, someone else in that room says almost the same thing, maybe with slightly different words, and suddenly the whole room is energized. People are writing it down. The boss is nodding. The idea gets adopted. And you're sitting there thinking, that was my idea. I said that. Why did theirs land and mine didn't? If you felt that, and most people reading this have felt that more times than they'd like to admit, here is the truth that will reframe everything you think you know about communication. The problem was never your idea. The problem was never your intelligence. The problem was never even your words. The problem was your authority signal. Because here's something the world does not teach you. Human beings do not listen to information. They listen to authority. Before your brain consciously processes what someone is saying, it has already run a rapid, unconscious assessment. Is this person worth listening to? And that assessment happens so fast, so automatically, and so far below the level of conscious thought that neither the listener nor the speaker is even aware it's happening. Neuroscientists have a name for this. It's called P-attentive processing, the brain's system for filtering what deserves full attention before the conscious mind even gets involved. And the brutal truth is this: if you fail that split-second test, nothing else you say will matter. You could quote Einstein. You could be completely right. You could have the solution to the exact problem the room is trying to solve, and it will not matter, because the listener's brain has already filed you in the low authority folder, and it is not easy to get out of that folder once you're in it. This is what researchers call the authority gap, the invisible distance between what you're saying and how much weight it carries. And it explains something you probably noticed your entire life, that the most confident-sounding person in the room is almost always the most believed, even when they are not the most accurate, the most experienced, or the most qualified. Albert Mehrabian's foundational research at UCLA produced a finding that still shocks people when they hear it for the first time. When it comes to the communication of attitude and feeling, which is exactly what authority is, only 7% of that perception comes from your actual words. 38% comes from your vocal qualities, your tone, your tempo, your resonance, and 55% comes from your nonverbal presence, the way you hold your body, your stillness, your eye contact. Now this ratio shifts depending on context. In a podcast or an audiobook, the voice carries far more weight, but the core principle is unshakable. How you communicate carries more weight than what you communicate, every single time. So why doesn't anyone teach this? Think about every class you ever sat through. English class taught you to write with precision. Speech class, if you were lucky enough to have one, taught you to stand straight and project to the back of the room. Maybe a teacher somewhere told you to make eye contact. But none of those well-meaning educators ever sat you down and explained the psychology of why certain voices carry undeniable gravity. Why, when certain people speak, the room reorganizes itself around them. Why certain voices make people feel like following, like believing, like trusting, like acting. This gap in your education is not an accident. It is a reflection of a culture that mistakes volume for authority, mistakes credentials for command, mistakes talking for communicating. The result? Millions of brilliant, hard-working, deeply capable Americans walking through their lives being consistently underestimated, speaking in meetings but not being heard, making cases that don't get taken seriously, watching less qualified people get promoted, get believed, get chosen not because they're smarter or better prepared, but because they have somehow mastered the signal that the brain reads as this person is worth listening to. Consider a name. Most Americans know Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not a physically imposing speaker. He was tall but awkward. His voice was high-pitched by many accounts, and he came from a background of poverty that gave him no natural social authority. And yet when Lincoln spoke in the Senate chamber, in debates, in letters read aloud, people stopped. People listened. People were moved, not because of his volume, not because of his title, because Lincoln understood something intuitively that took scientists another 150 years to verify. Authority is not a performance. It is a posture. It is an internal state of settled conviction that the voice reflects automatically. Lincoln didn't try to sound authoritative. He was convinced in his bones that what he had to say mattered, and the human nervous system, which has spent thousands of years reading the signals of other nervous systems, picked that up instantly. Here is a more recent example. Think about the first time you heard Michelle Obama speak at a major national event. Notice what happened in your body. There was a settling, a leaning in, an almost involuntary sense of this person is in command. And if you study her delivery, her pace, her pausing, the controlled weight in her tone, you begin to see the blueprint. She does not rush. She does not apologize. She does not trail off at the end of a sentence hoping you'll still be with her. She speaks as if the space she's filling with her words belongs to her. That is authority, not arrogance, not aggression, authority. And the difference matters enormously, because people often confuse the two, and in trying to avoid sounding arrogant, they swing so far toward the quiet, the hedging, the softening, that they end up sounding like they don't even believe what they're saying. Here is the first principle of this entire audiobook, and you need to hear it clearly. Authority is not something you claim. It is something you radiate, and radiation is not a one-time decision. It is the cumulative product of how you habitually think about yourself, how you habitually carry yourself, and how you habitually use your voice. Which means the work we are about to do together is not surface work. You're not going to walk away from this audiobook with a list of phrases to memorize. You're going to walk away with a fundamentally different understanding of what speaking with authority actually requires, and a clear, practical map for building it in your own life, in your own voice, in your own body. Now, here is what this means for you practically in this moment. Start paying attention today, tonight, in every conversation you enter for the rest of this week, to the difference in how different voices land in your nervous system. When someone speaks and you feel pulled toward them, tuned in without trying, curious and engaged, notice that. What are they doing? What is the quality of their silence? How do they begin their sentences? What happens to their voice at the end of a thought? And when someone speaks and you find yourself drifting, checking out, half listening, reaching for your phone, notice that too, because that drift is not rudeness. That drift is your nervous system giving an honest verdict on the authority signal it just received. You are a receiver as well as a transmitter, and one of the fastest ways to improve the signal you send is to become deeply conscious of the signals you receive. As James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, put it in a way that applies far beyond habit formation, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. The same is precisely true of authority. You do not rise to the level of your intentions when you speak. You fall to the level of your habits, your defaults, the ingrained patterns you have never consciously examined. This audiobook is the examination. Over the chapters ahead, we are going to take apart the architecture of authoritative communication piece by piece: the body before the voice before the words before the silence. And then we are going to put it back together in a way that serves you specifically in the rooms you walk into, the conversations that matter to you, the life you are actually trying to build. Because here's the thing nobody told you, and it is perhaps the single most important idea in this entire book: you were not born into authority. Nobody was. Every person you have ever admired for the power of their presence, every leader, every speaker, every communicator who made you feel the earth shift slightly when they walked into a room, they built that. Piece by piece, habit by habit, conversation by conversation. Many of them started exactly where you are right now, smart, capable, full of things worth saying, and frustrated that the world wasn't hearing them the way they deserved to be heard. The gap between where you are and where those people are is not talent. It is not destiny. It is not some mysterious gift that a lucky few were handed and the rest were not. The gap is knowledge, and the application of that knowledge. You now have the knowledge. In Chapter 2, we go deeper into the body itself, into the breath, the stillness, and the thing that happens in the 3 seconds before you speak that either builds your authority or silently destroys it. Most people rush that moment. After Chapter 2, you will never rush it again. Stay with me. Chapter 2. The body speaks before you do. Command the room before you say a word. There is a conversation happening right now in every room you walk into, in every meeting you sit down, for in every interaction you have with another human being, and this conversation is happening entirely without words. Before you open your mouth, before you clear your throat, before you say good morning, introduce yourself, or offer your first thought, your body has already delivered a full report on who you are, and the people around you have already read it, processed it, and filed their verdict somewhere below the level of conscious thought where they will rarely ever go back to examine it. This is not speculation. This is not motivational framing. This is one of the most well-documented and consistently replicated findings in all of social psychology. The human body communicates status, confidence, threat level, and trustworthiness in ways that are older than language itself, older than civilization, older than culture, older than every book ever written about how to speak well. Your ancestors were reading these signals around fires and in dense forests 60,000 years before anyone thought to write a word down, and that ancient reading system is still running in every person you will ever speak to. It never got an update. It never got patched. It is still scanning, still filtering, still issuing its rapid verdicts on every body that enters its field of awareness. Which means, before you ever think about what to say, before you rehearse a single line, before you practice a single argument, you need to understand what your body is saying when you think nobody is listening. Here's the hard truth for a lot of people. Your body has been undermining your authority for years, not because you're weak, not because you're incompetent, but because nobody ever told you that the way you stand, the way you breathe, the way you enter a space, and the 3 seconds of silence before you speak carry more persuasive weight than almost anything that comes out of your mouth afterward. You have been pouring extraordinary effort into crafting your words, sharpening your arguments, and building your vocabulary, while the foundation underneath all of those words has been quietly sending a completely different message. Today that changes. Let's start with posture, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a neurological one. Amy Cuddy, a social psychologist at Harvard Business School, conducted research that produced one of the most discussed findings in the last 20 years of behavioral science. Her studies show that the physical positions your body holds don't just communicate your internal state to others, they actually change your internal state. When you hold what she called a power pose, chest open, spine tall, shoulders back and down, weight evenly grounded, your body begins producing more testosterone, the hormone associated with confidence and dominance, and less cortisol, the hormone associated with stress and anxiety. Your body is not just expressing confidence, it is manufacturing it. But here's what Cuddy's research points to that most people miss when they encounter this idea. The most important audience for your body language is not the person across from you. It is you. The way you physically inhabit your own body in the moments before a high-stakes conversation directly alters the neurochemical environment in which that conversation will take place. You are either setting the stage for authority, or you are dismantling it, and you are doing it before a single word has been spoken. Think about the last time you walked into a room where you felt nervous. Maybe it was a job interview. Maybe it was a difficult conversation with someone who had power over you. Maybe it was a presentation to people whose opinions you cared deeply about. Do you remember what your body was doing? Shoulders slightly forward, chest slightly closed, breathing shallow and high in the chest rather than deep and low, eyes downcast or darting small movements, compressed presence. Your body was making itself smaller, and as it did, it was signaling to everyone in the room, including your own nervous system, that you were not in command of this space. Now, think about someone you've watched walk into a room with undeniable authority. Think about a leader you've admired, a speaker you've studied, a person who simply seemed to own whatever environment they entered. Their body was doing something completely different. They were not rushing. They were not contracting. Their spine was long, their movement was deliberate, their gaze was settled and direct. They took up space, not aggressively, not in a way that imposed on others, but fully. They occupied their body completely, and the room responded to that occupation before they ever opened their mouth. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation. Everything else we will build in this audiobook sits on top of this foundation. And if the foundation is cracked, no amount of vocabulary or vocal technique or strategic framing will save you. You cannot speak with authority from a collapsed body. The signal contradicts the content, and the brain of your listener will always trust the signal over the content. So let's talk about the specific elements of authoritative physical presence, the ones that matter most, and the ones you can begin practicing today. The first is your breath. This is the most underestimated authority tool in existence. Most people, under pressure, breathe in a way that physiologically produces anxiety. Short, shallow breaths that live in the chest activate the sympathetic nervous system, the same system that fires when you are in genuine physical danger. Your heart rate climbs, your throat tightens, your voice thins out and rises in pitch. Your thoughts scatter, and your audience, who are not consciously aware of any of this, simply knows at some deep, instinctive level that you are not settled, that you are not grounded, that you are not, in this moment, the authority in the room. The antidote is diaphragmatic breathing, deep, slow breaths that fill the lower lungs, expand the belly, and activate the parasympathetic nervous system. The system of calm, the system of presence. When you breathe this way, your voice drops naturally to its most resonant register. Your thoughts slow down and clarify. Your body becomes still and grounded, and the people around you feel the shift not intellectually, but in their own nervous systems, which are constantly mirroring the state of the most regulated person in the room. Before any significant conversation, any presentation, any high-stakes interaction, breathe. Take 3 deep, slow breaths from the diaphragm, not as a relaxation technique. As a command decision, you are choosing, in those 3 breaths, to inhabit your most authoritative self before the exchange even begins. The second element is stillness. Authoritative people are remarkably still. They do not fidget. They do not touch their face, adjust their hair, shift their weight repeatedly from foot to foot, or fill space with nervous physical noise. Stillness communicates certainty. It communicates that you have nowhere more important to be, nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. It says without a syllable that you are comfortable in this moment, and comfort is contagious. When you are still, the people around you settle too. The third element is eye contact, but not the aggressive, unblinking kind that makes people feel interrogated. Authoritative eye contact is warm and direct. It says, "I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see." It lingers without staring. It moves with purpose rather than anxiety. When you speak to a group, authoritative eye contact lands on one person for a complete thought, then moves to another, not scanning, not darting landing. Each person in that room, when your gaze reaches them, feels individually seen, and people who feel seen will follow you almost anywhere. The fourth element is the deliberate pause before you speak. This is the one most people sacrifice first under pressure, and it is one of the most powerful authority signals in existence. When someone asks you a question, when you're about to make an important point, when you enter a conversation that matters, pause first. Not from hesitation, not from uncertainty, from command, because only people who own the room can afford to be silent in it. The person who rushes to fill silence with words is the person who is afraid of what silence might reveal. The person who can sit comfortably in a moment of silence before they speak is telling everyone present, without a word, that they trust themselves completely. Think about the late Kobe Bryant in post-game interviews. Think about Barack Obama's measured pauses mid-sentence, the way silence became emphasis, the way the audience leaned in precisely because he wasn't rushing to give them the next word. These were not accidents. These were men who understood at an instinctive level that silence is not the absence of authority. Silence is authority. Used correctly, it is the loudest thing in the room. Now, here is the integration, the place where all four of these elements come together into a single, repeatable practice. Before your next important conversation, whether it's a meeting, a difficult discussion, a phone call, or a presentation, take 60 seconds. Stand up straight, feet planted shoulder-width apart. Drop your shoulders back and down. Take 3 deep, full breaths from your diaphragm. Feel the ground beneath your feet. And then, when you enter that room or that conversation, move slowly, deliberately, and without apology. Do not rush to speak. Let the room settle around you. And when you finally open your mouth, speak from that settled, grounded, certain place. What comes out of your mouth in that state will sound different than anything you have produced when you are anxious, contracted, and rushing. Your voice will carry. Your words will land. And the people around you will lean in without knowing why, without being able to explain it, because their nervous systems will have already received the most important message you will send all day. The message that you belong in this room. The message that what you are about to say is worth hearing. The message that you are, in the fullest and most complete sense of the phrase, someone worth listening to. In Chapter 3, we move from the body to the instrument. The body houses your voice itself, the pitch, the pace, the resonance, the pause, and the specific patterns that the most commanding voices in American history all share. What you learn in the next chapter will change the way you hear your own voice forever. Stay with me. Chapter 3. Your voice is an instrument. Learn to play it like a master. Close your eyes for a moment and think about the most powerful voice you have ever heard in your life. Not the loudest, not the most polished, not the most technically perfect, the most powerful. The voice that, when it entered your ears, made something shift inside you. The voice that made you stop what you were doing, turn your head, and give your full attention without being asked for it. The voice that carried something beyond words, something that landed in your chest before it ever reached your conscious mind. Now ask yourself this question honestly. What made that voice different from every other voice you heard that day? Because here's something most people have never been told, and it is one of the most empowering truths in all of human communication. That voice you just thought of was not an accident of genetics. It was not a gift handed down from the universe to a lucky few, while the rest of humanity was left to speak in flat, forgettable tones. That voice was built, it was shaped, refined, and mastered through an understanding of something that very few people ever deliberately study: the mechanics and psychology of vocal authority. Your voice is an instrument, and like every instrument that has ever produced something extraordinary, it does not perform at its highest level by accident. It performs at its highest level when the person holding it understands exactly what it is capable of, exactly what controls its output, and exactly how to use it with intention, rather than simply letting it run on default. Most people let their voice run on default their entire lives. They speak the way they learned to speak as children, in the environments they grew up in, at the pace and pitch and volume that became habitual long before they ever thought consciously about communication. And then they wonder why certain conversations don't go the way they intended. They wonder why their ideas don't carry the weight they deserve. They wonder why other people seem to command rooms effortlessly while they feel invisible in the very same spaces. The answer, more often than not, lives in the voice. Let's begin with the element that carries the most authority signal of all, and that is pitch. Not high pitch or low pitch as moral judgments, but pitch as a tool of perception. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that speakers with lower, more resonant vocal tones are consistently rated as more dominant, more competent, more trustworthy, and more leader-like than speakers with higher, thinner tones, regardless of what those speakers actually said. The content was identical. The perception was completely different. The voice was the variable. Now, you cannot dramatically change the natural pitch of your voice, and you should never try to manufacture a fake register that doesn't belong to you. But here's what you can do, and what most people never bother to do. You can speak from the bottom of your natural range rather than the anxious top of it. Because under stress, under pressure, under the weight of a high-stakes moment, almost every human voice climbs. It rises in pitch, thins in quality, and loses the resonance that makes it feel authoritative. This is not weakness. This is pure biology. The stress response tightens the muscles around your vocal cords, which shortens the vibration, which raises the pitch. It happens automatically, involuntarily, and constantly unless you learn to counteract it. The counteraction is breath, as we discussed in Chapter 2, combined with conscious placement of your voice in the chest rather than the throat. When you speak from your chest cavity, when you feel the vibration in your sternum rather than just your throat, your voice gains a warmth and resonance that registers immediately in the nervous system of whoever is listening. It feels more grounded, more trustworthy, more real, and in a world saturated with voices that sound thin, rushed, and anxious, a grounded voice is one of the most striking things a person can encounter. James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader, the voice of Mufasa, one of the most recognized voices in American cultural history, once said something that every communicator needs to hear. One of the hardest things in life is having words in your heart that you can't utter. Jones himself grew up with a severe stutter that left him nearly mute for years. The voice that would eventually shake movie theaters and silence audiences was built through years of deliberate, conscious work on the instrument. Not gifted, built. Now let's talk about pace, because this is where most people hemorrhage authority without ever realizing it. Speed is the enemy of authority, not because slowness is inherently powerful, but because rushing communicates something your listener's nervous system reads immediately and accurately: anxiety. When you speak too fast, when your words tumble over each other in a race to get everything out before the silence comes, you are sending a subconscious signal that says you are not sure you will be heard, that you don't trust the room to wait for you, that you are operating from a place of scarcity rather than command. The antidote is not slow speech for the sake of performance. The antidote is deliberate pacing, speaking at the speed of someone who knows the room is waiting on them, not wondering if the room has already moved on. Think about the late Steve Jobs during his legendary Apple keynote presentations. Jobs spoke at a pace that felt almost uncomfortably slow to people raised on fast-talking media. He paused between sentences. He let ideas settle. He never raced, and the result was that every single word he delivered felt significant, felt like it had been placed there with purpose, because it had. The audience didn't drift. They leaned in, because a slow, deliberate voice trains the brain to pay attention the same way a slowly ticking clock draws the ear more than a fast one. Practice this in your next important conversation. Speak at roughly 70% of your instinctive pace, not half speed, just slightly slower than what feels natural under pressure. You will notice immediately that your voice deepens slightly, your thoughts clarify, and the people you're speaking to become measurably more engaged. The words have room to land. The third vocal element we need to address is one of the most misused and most undervalued tools in the entire communication arsenal, and that is the strategic pause. Most people think of pausing as the absence of speaking, as dead air, as the awkward silence that needs to be filled as quickly as possible with more words, more filler, more explanation, more anything. But for the speaker who understands vocal authority, the pause is not absence. The pause is punctuation. The pause is emphasis. The pause is the moment in which your last idea gets to echo in the room and settle fully into the minds of the people receiving it. Think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s delivery of "I have a dream." If you study the audio, really study it, you will notice that the pauses are as carefully constructed as the words themselves. The silence after "I have a dream" is not empty. It is loaded. It is the moment the audience catches up to the emotion, the moment the idea expands beyond the words that carried it. King understood instinctively what voice coaches spend careers trying to teach. The pause gives the listener permission to feel what you just said. And once a listener is feeling, they are no longer casually consuming your words. They are inside your message. That's a completely different level of engagement. Use the pause after your most important points. Use it before a key word you want to emphasize, letting the silence build anticipation so the word arrives with maximum impact. Use it after a question, even a rhetorical one, giving the listener's brain the fraction of a second it needs to generate its own internal answer. Because the moment your listener starts answering your questions in their own mind, they have stopped being a passive audience and become an active participant, and active participants do not leave. The fourth element is tonal variation, what voice coaches call the musicality of speech. A voice that stays at one pitch, one volume, one emotional temperature for an extended period of time does something devastating to the listener's attention. It lulls them. The brain is hardwired to notice change, to track variation, to stay alert in the presence of contrast. A voice with no variation is the audio equivalent of a flat landscape. Your eye, or in this case your ear, has nothing to catch on. You drift. Authoritative speakers modulate constantly and deliberately. They drop their volume before a powerful point, drawing the listener in closer. They raise their energy slightly at the opening of a new idea, signaling that something worth tracking is arriving. They let warmth enter their tone when they want the listener to feel connected, and they let steel enter it when they want the listener to feel the weight of what's being said. The voice moves the way music moves, not randomly, but with intention, with architecture, with a clear understanding of where the emotional peak is and how to build toward it, and then release it. Maya Angelou, poet, author, and one of the most profoundly compelling voices in American literary history, once said, "Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with deeper meaning." She was right in a way that goes far deeper than poetry. The same sentence delivered by two different voices, with two different paces, two different pauses, two different tonal qualities, lands as two completely different experiences. The words are identical, the impact is not, because the voice is not the vehicle for the words. The voice is the experience itself. Your voice is your most powerful tool of influence, not your resume, not your title, not your vocabulary, the living, breathing, vibrating instrument that lives in your chest and carries everything you have ever thought and felt and known into the world. Most people spend a lifetime speaking without ever truly learning to play it. You are not most people. In Chapter 4, we go deeper into the architecture of authoritative language itself, the specific words, sentence structures, and framing patterns that make people lean forward rather than drift away. The voice carries the message, but the structure of the message determines whether the message is worth carrying at all. Stay with me. Chapter 4. The architecture of authoritative language, words that command belief. Words are not equal. That is the single most important idea this chapter will give you, and everything else that follows is built on top of it. Because most people walk through their lives operating under the unconscious assumption that words are simply containers for meaning, that as long as your meaning is clear, one word is roughly as good as another, that as long as the idea is right, the language carrying it is just packaging, just delivery. That assumption is costing you more than you know. The reality, backed by decades of research in linguistics, behavioral psychology, and neuroscience, is that specific words and sentence structures do not just communicate ideas, they generate emotional states, trigger neurological responses, and activate deep psychological patterns that determine whether a listener believes you, dismisses you, follows you, or forgets you within 60 seconds of the conversation ending. The words you choose are not packaging. They are the product itself. And the difference between a sentence that lands with authority and a sentence that dissolves into the air the moment it leaves your mouth is rarely about the idea. It is almost always about the architecture. So today we are going to become architects. We are going to take apart the language patterns that silently destroy your authority, the ones you are probably using right now without realizing it, and replace them, piece by piece, with the structures that the most commanding communicators in business, politics, and public life have used to make their words feel inevitable, credible, and impossible to dismiss. Let's begin with the most common authority killer in the English language, and that is the hedge. A hedge is any word or phrase that softens a statement to the point of meaninglessness. You know them well because you use them constantly, because the culture you grew up in rewarded them. Phrases like, "I just think," and "it might be worth considering," and "this is probably a dumb question, but," and "I'm not sure if this makes sense." Phrases like "sort of" and "kind of" and "maybe" inserted into sentences that would have carried real weight without them. Phrases that announce, before the idea even arrives, that you are not fully committed to the thing you are about to say. Here's the psychological reality of what happens when you hedge. The listener's brain, which is constantly scanning for signals of conviction, picks up the hedge immediately and uses it as permission to do the one thing you never want a listener to do: discount what follows. When you say, "I might be wrong, but I think we should reconsider this strategy," you have just handed your listener a pre-built escape hatch from your idea. They don't have to argue with it. They don't have to engage with it. They can simply note that you yourself said you might be wrong and move on. Compare that sentence to this one. "We need to reconsider this strategy, and here is why." Same idea. Completely different authority signal. The second version does not beg for permission to be heard. It assumes it. And that assumption of the right to be heard is exactly what your listeners need to experience from you before they will invest their full attention. Now, eliminating hedges does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean pretending certainty you don't have. There is an important and sophisticated distinction between hedging, which communicates insecurity, and appropriate qualification, which communicates precision. Saying "based on the data we currently have" is not a hedge. It is a calibrated, intelligent framing that actually increases your credibility by showing that you think carefully before you speak. The difference is intention. Hedging comes from fear of being wrong. Qualification comes from commitment to accuracy. Your listener can feel the difference even when they cannot articulate it. The second major architecture shift involves what linguists call nominalization, the habit of turning active, vivid, emotionally engaging language into abstract, flat, bureaucratic nouns. This is one of the most insidious authority destroyers in professional and corporate communication, and once you see it, you will never be able to unsee it. Here is an example. Compare these two sentences. First, we need to make a decision about the implementation of the new communication strategy. Second, we need to decide how to communicate this, and we need to decide now. The first sentence is technically correct. The second sentence has life in it. It has urgency, clarity, and a direct call to action. The difference is that the first sentence has buried its most powerful words decide and communicate inside abstract nouns, decision, and communication. When you bury your verbs inside nouns, you drain the energy from your language the way a leak drains water from a tire. The structure still holds, but the power is slowly bleeding out. Authoritative language lives in strong, direct verbs. It moves. It acts. It does not discuss the facilitation of outcomes. It makes things happen. It does not engage in the exploration of possibilities. It explores. Every time you catch yourself reaching for an abstract noun where a verb could live, choose the verb. Your language will become leaner, faster, and exponentially more commanding. The third structural element of authoritative language is what rhetoricians have called, since the time of ancient Greece, the rule of three. And the reason this device has survived from Aristotle to Abraham Lincoln to Steve Jobs to every TED Talk you have ever watched and remembered is not tradition. It is neuroscience. The human brain has a deep structural preference for patterns. Of three, 3 feels complete, 3 feels balanced, 2 feels unfinished, 4 feels excessive. 3 is the cognitive sweet spot where rhythm, persuasion, and memorability all converge at the same time. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address gave us government of the people, by the people, for the people. Julius Caesar gave us Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Steve Jobs introduced the original iPhone, not as a phone with many features, but as an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. 3 elements, 3 beats, and the room remembered it 20 years later. When you structure your key points in groups of 3, when you build your arguments around a 3-part framework, when you close your most important statements with a 3-beat rhythm, you are not using a rhetorical trick. You are aligning your language with the natural architecture of human cognition. And when your language aligns with the way your listener's brain naturally processes information, that listener does not just understand you more easily, they trust you more completely, because your message feels, at some deep level, like it was made for them. The fourth element is perhaps the most psychologically powerful of all, and it is the art of the definitive statement. Most people, when they want to make an important point, build up to it slowly. They contextualize, they qualify, they provide background, they layer in caveats, and by the time the actual point arrives, the listener's brain has been waiting so long that the point lands with a fraction of the impact it deserved. Authoritative communicators do the opposite. They lead with a conclusion. They open with the point and then support it, rather than building toward it and hoping the listener is still engaged by the time they arrive. This structure, which journalists call the inverted pyramid, and rhetoricians call the periodic sentences opposite, does something crucial for your authority. It signals that you know exactly what you think. You are not working it out as you speak. You have already worked it out, and now you are sharing the outcome with people whose time you respect. When you lead with your conclusion, you are saying, without words, I came here prepared. I know what I think. I know what I am here to say. And that signal of preparedness and conviction is one of the most powerful authority cues a human being can receive. Consider how Warren Buffett communicates. In interviews, in shareholder letters, in public statements, Buffett is famous for leading with his position and then explaining it, rather than building to it. He does not say, well, there are many factors to consider, and some of them point in one direction while others point in another. And taking everything into account, I think perhaps we might lean toward, he says, this is a great company. Here is why. The clarity is not accidental. The authority it generates is not accidental. The structure was chosen. The fifth element is the use of concrete, specific language over vague generality. Vague language is the sound of someone who is not fully committed to their own idea. Specific language is the sound of someone who has lived inside their idea long enough to know its exact shape. When you tell someone, this will take a long time, you have given them nothing to hold. When you tell them, this will take 6 weeks, you have given them a wall to push against, a number to work with, a reality to respond to. Specificity is the language of expertise, and expertise is one of the most powerful authority signals in existence. As the poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in a line that cuts straight to the heart of this entire chapter, speech is power. Speech is to persuade, to convert, to compel. But speech only carries that power when it is structured to carry it. Beautiful ideas trapped in weak, hedging, vague, passive language will be forgotten before the conversation ends. The same ideas delivered in clear, direct, vivid, architecturally sound language will outlast the room and change what people do next. You now have the blueprint for the language of authority. In Chapter 5, the chapter that sits at the absolute heart of this audiobook, we go into the deepest level of all. Not how you sound, not what words you use, but why people choose to believe certain voices over others. The psychology of credibility. The triggers that make a listener's brain decide, in under 7 seconds, whether you are worth trusting with their full attention. What you learn in Chapter 5 will change the way you walk into every room for the rest of your life. Stay with me. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Credibility. Why people believe some voices and dismiss others. There is a moment that happens in every significant conversation, every presentation, every interaction where something real is at stake, and it happens so fast that most people never even know it occurred. It happens in the first 7 seconds. In those 7 seconds, before you have made your argument, before you have presented your evidence, Before you have said anything of real substance, the person across from you has already made a decision. Not a conscious decision, not a deliberate reasoned judgment that they could explain to you if you asked. A deep, automatic neurological decision that will color every single thing you say from that moment forward. And that decision is this: are you credible? Not are you smart? Not are you right? Not are you qualified? Those things come later, if they come at all. The first question the human brain asks about any new voice it encounters is a much more primitive one, and it is a question that was being asked around campfires long before the concepts of intelligence or qualification even existed. The question is, can I trust this person with my attention? And the answer, delivered in 7 seconds or less, determines the entire trajectory of everything that follows. This is the psychology of credibility, and understanding it truly, understanding it at the level where you can work with it consciously, rather than being subject to it unconsciously, is the single most transformative shift available to anyone who wants to speak with real authority. So let's pull this apart completely. Credibility, as psychologists define it, is not a single thing. It is a perception built from 3 distinct components that operate simultaneously in the mind of your listener. The first component is competence, the sense that you know what you are talking about. The second is character, the sense that you are honest, that you have no hidden agenda, that what you are saying reflects what you actually believe. And the third is what researchers call warmth or benevolence, the sense that you care about the person you are speaking to, that their interests matter to you, that you are not simply using the conversation to advance yourself at their expense. Here's the part that surprises most people when they first encounter this framework. You would expect competence to be the most important of these 3. You would expect that demonstrating mastery of your subject, showing that you clearly know your field, that your facts are accurate, that your reasoning is sound, would be the dominant factor in whether someone finds you credible. But the research says something different. The research, across dozens of studies spanning multiple decades, consistently shows that warmth is assessed first, and that warmth has a disproportionate influence on whether competence even gets a fair hearing. In other words, if your listener does not feel, in those first 7 seconds, that you are fundamentally on their side, that you have their interests somewhere in your awareness, that you are a safe person to trust with their attention, then your competence will not save you. They will find reasons to discount your expertise. They will look for flaws in your reasoning that they would have overlooked entirely if you had first established warmth. They will listen to your words while simultaneously building a case against you, because the brain, once it has decided that a speaker is not safe to trust, does not neutrally evaluate what that speaker says. It actively defends against it. This is why the most technically brilliant person in the room is so often not the most persuasive. This is why the expert with perfect credentials and impeccable data so frequently loses the argument to someone with fewer qualifications, but far stronger human presence. Not because the world is unfair, though sometimes it is, but because credibility is not primarily an intellectual achievement. It is an emotional one. Think about 2 doctors delivering the same diagnosis to the same patient. The first doctor walks in reading from a clipboard, delivers the information in precise clinical language, answers questions with technical accuracy, and leaves within 7 minutes. The second doctor walks in, sits down at eye level, makes direct and warm eye contact, asks how the patient has been sleeping, delivers the same information in language that feels human rather than medical, and stays an extra 3 minutes to make sure every question has been fully addressed. Both doctors gave the patient identical information, but study after study in medical communication research shows that patients of the second doctor not only rate their experience more highly, They are more likely to follow the prescribed treatment. The credibility of the message changed the behavior it produced, not the content of the message, the credibility. Now let's talk about the specific practical signals that build credibility in the mind of your listener, because this is where the knowledge becomes power. The first credibility signal is what researchers call confident humility, and it is one of the most sophisticated communication tools available to anyone who wants to be genuinely believed. Confident humility is the ability to speak with complete conviction about what you know while being openly, comfortably honest about what you do not know. This combination is extraordinarily rare, and the brain recognizes its rarity immediately. When someone says, "I am certain about this," and "I am uncertain about that," with equal steadiness, no defensiveness about the uncertainty, no inflation of the certainty, the listener's brain receives a signal that is almost impossible to fake. This person is calibrated. This person is not performing. This person can be trusted to tell me the truth because they have already demonstrated that they will not shade reality to protect their image. The speaker who claims to know everything triggers suspicion. The speaker who admits uncertainty with the same confidence they bring to their convictions triggers trust. And trust, once established, is the most powerful amplifier of everything else you say. The second credibility signal is consistency between your verbal and nonverbal communication, what psychologists call congruence. When your body language, your facial expression, your vocal tone, and your words are all saying the same thing at the same time, the listener's brain experiences a sense of coherence that registers as trustworthiness. When they are misaligned, when your words say one thing and your body says another, when your tone contradicts your content, when you claim certainty but your eyes are looking for an exit, the brain notices the inconsistency immediately. It doesn't always consciously identify what it noticed, but it files the speaker in the unreliable category, and it rarely revisits that filing. This is why authenticity is not a soft concept. It is a hard neurological requirement for credibility. You cannot sustainably perform a version of yourself that does not align with your actual internal state. The body will leak the truth. The micro-expressions will betray the performance. The voice will crack slightly at exactly the wrong moment. The only long-term path to consistent credibility is to genuinely become the person your words are describing, which is the work of a lifetime, but which begins today, in the very next conversation you have. The third credibility signal is what communication researchers call social proof, anchoring the deliberate, natural use of shared reference points, respected sources, and acknowledged authorities to establish that your position is not isolated, not invented, not a personal opinion disconnected from any larger body of knowledge or experience. When you reference a relevant study, cite a respected thinker, point to a historical precedent, or connect your idea to something the listener already respects and believes, you are not name-dropping. You are building a credibility bridge between yourself and a source of authority the listener has already accepted. And once that bridge is built, some of that existing authority flows across it in your direction. Think about how the most respected voices in American business communication use this instinctively. When Jamie Dimon makes a statement about the economy, he anchors it in data, historical precedent, and the collective experience of institutions with decades of track records. He is not just offering an opinion, he is positioning his opinion within a larger architecture of established credibility, and the listener, whether consciously or not, evaluates his statement, not just as an isolated claim, but as a node in a network of trusted sources. The credibility of the network elevates the credibility of the node. The fourth and perhaps most deeply human credibility signal is vulnerability. Specifically, the willingness to share a genuine moment of difficulty, failure, or uncertainty from your own experience in the service of the point you are making. This is counterintuitive for many people who equate vulnerability with weakness, and weakness with diminished authority. But the psychological reality is precisely the opposite. Strategic, purposeful vulnerability, the kind that says, I have been where you are, I have faced what you are facing. I am not speaking to you from some elevated position of permanent success, but from the shared ground of real human experience, is one of the most powerful credibility accelerators in existence. Brené Brown built an entire global career on this insight. Her 2010 TED Talk on vulnerability became one of the most watched TED Talks in history, not because her research was more rigorous than everyone else's, but because she stood in front of an audience and said with complete authority and zero apology, I am a researcher who studies human connection, and I had a breakdown. Here's what I learned from it. The vulnerability did not reduce her credibility. It multiplied it. Because every person in that room recognized the truth of her experience in their own experience. And recognition is the foundation of trust. As the great Maya Angelou once said, in words that every communicator should carry permanently, people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. Credibility, at its deepest level, is not an intellectual achievement. It is an emotional experience. It is the feeling a listener has after hearing you, after spending time in your presence, after being subject to the full force of your communication that you are real, that you are trustworthy, and that what you had to say was worth every second of their attention. In Chapter 6, we take everything you have built so far, the body, the voice, the language, the credibility, and we walk directly into the highest pressure situations where all of it gets tested at the same time. The boardroom, the difficult conversation, the confrontation you have been avoiding for weeks, the moment when everything you know about speaking with authority either holds or it doesn't. This is where the real work begins. Stay with me. Chapter 6, Authority Under Fire. How to command the room when the stakes are highest. Everything you have learned so far, the body, the breath, the voice, the language architecture, the psychology of credibility has been preparation for this moment. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that most communication books never address directly. It is remarkably easy to speak with authority when nothing is at stake, when the room is friendly, when the topic is safe, when nobody is challenging you, when the outcome doesn't matter. Almost anyone can sound composed, confident, and commanding. The real test of your authority is not who you are in comfortable conversations. The real test is who you are when the pressure arrives, when the room turns cold, when someone pushes back hard on something you said, when the stakes are so high that your nervous system starts flooding your body with every chemical it knows how to produce, and you still have to stand there and speak. That is the crucible, and that is exactly where we are going right now. Think about the high-stakes situations that exist in your actual life. The performance review where you need to advocate for yourself without sounding defensive or desperate. The boardroom presentation where every person in the room has more institutional authority than you, and you need to make them believe in your idea anyway. The difficult conversation with a partner, a parent, a friend where the emotional charge is so high that your throat tightens before you even begin. The confrontation with a colleague who has been undermining you, that you have been putting off for 3 weeks because you cannot figure out how to have it without either backing down completely or burning the relationship to the ground. These are the moments that define your reputation, your relationships, and your trajectory. These are the moments that separate the people who speak with real authority from the people who only speak with authority when it costs them nothing. So let's build your framework for exactly these moments piece by piece, situation by situation, with the precision and practicality that high stakes demand. The first principle of authority under pressure is what we will call the regulation imperative, and it is this: you cannot access your highest communication when your nervous system is in a state of threat response. This sounds obvious when you read it, but the number of people who walk into the most important conversations of their lives in a state of full physiological activation, heart racing, thoughts fragmenting, voice thinning, body contracting, and then wonder why the conversation did not go the way they intended is staggering. The regulation imperative means that before you enter any high-stakes interaction, your first responsibility is not to prepare your arguments. Your first responsibility is to regulate your nervous system to a state where your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for sophisticated reasoning, emotional calibration, and nuanced language, is actually online and available to you. Because when the stress response is fully activated, the prefrontal cortex goes partially offline. The brain shifts resources toward the older, faster, more reactive systems, the ones designed for physical survival, not boardroom persuasion. And you cannot speak with authority from the survival brain. You can only react from it. The practice is the breathwork from Chapter 2, deployed deliberately and without apology in the moments before the interaction begins. 3 deep diaphragmatic breaths, a conscious dropping of the shoulders, a deliberate grounding of the feet into the floor. These are not wellness rituals, they are performance protocols. They are the difference between walking into a high-stakes room as the person you prepared to be and walking in as the person your stress response has temporarily turned you into. The second principle is what the best negotiators in the world call position from curiosity. Most people, when they walk into a confrontational or high-pressure conversation, walk in defended. Their body is braced. Their language is fortified with pre-built arguments and counter-arguments. Their energy communicates before a word is spoken that they are here to win, which means they have already framed this as a competition, and the moment your listener feels that you are here to defeat them rather than to understand them, their own defenses activate. Now, you are not having a conversation. You are having a battle, and battles rarely produce the outcome that either party actually wanted. Positioning from curiosity means entering the conversation with genuine questions rather than prepared speeches. It means your opening move is not to stake your position, but to understand theirs. Not as a manipulation tactic. The brain is extraordinarily good at detecting false curiosity, but as a genuine commitment to understanding the full landscape of the situation before you begin navigating it. Chris Voss, the former FBI lead hostage negotiator and author of Never Split the Difference, built an entire framework around this principle. In negotiations where the stakes were literally life and death, Voss found that the most powerful opening move was never to present a position. It was to demonstrate through careful, specific, reflective listening that you fully understood the other person's perspective, because a person who feels genuinely understood lowers their defenses, and a person with lower defenses is a person you can actually reach. The third principle is the management of pushback, and this is where most people's authority collapses most visibly and most painfully. When someone challenges your idea directly, when someone dismisses what you've said, when someone in the room contradicts you publicly, the stress response fires immediately, and it pulls you toward one of two equally damaging reactions. The first reaction is submission. You soften your position, you hedge, you begin apologizing for the idea, you shrink back from the space you are occupying. The second reaction is aggression. You get louder, you get faster, you lean forward with the body language of combat, You push back with force that reads as defensiveness rather than confidence. Both reactions destroy your authority. The authoritative response to pushback is neither of these. It is what we will call the grounded acknowledgement, and it is one of the most powerful communication moves available to you in a high-pressure situation. The grounded acknowledgement sounds like this: "That is a fair challenge. Here's my thinking on it." Or, "I hear what you were saying. The reason I still hold this position is," or, "You may be right about that aspect. Where I see it differently is." Notice what these responses do. They do not concede the point. They do not attack the challenger. They demonstrate that you are secure enough in your position to acknowledge an opposing view without being destabilized by it. And that security, that complete absence of defensiveness, is one of the most striking authority signals a human being can display in a high-pressure environment. It communicates that your confidence does not depend on everyone agreeing with you. It communicates that you have thought carefully enough about your position that a challenge does not shake it. It communicates, in the most visceral possible way, that you are operating from a place of genuine conviction rather than fragile ego. The fourth principle addresses one of the most specific and consistently damaging high-stakes scenarios: the moment when you are interrupted. In meetings, in conversations, in presentations, being interrupted is an authority test that most people fail silently. The typical response to being cut off mid-sentence is to stop speaking, to concede the floor, and to wait for a gap that may never arrive. And every time you do this, you are sending a signal to the room, to the person who interrupted you, and most importantly to yourself, that your voice does not have the right to the space it was occupying. The authoritative response to being interrupted is to continue speaking calmly, at the same measured pace, without raising your voice, and without acknowledging the interruption with a change in your expression or your energy. Not aggressively. Not in a way that turns the interaction into a power struggle. Simply by completing your thought with the same settled conviction you had when you began it. Most people, when they interrupt and the speaker continues calmly, will stop, because the speaker's behavior has communicated something that cannot be argued with. "What I was saying was not finished, and it is important enough that I am going to finish it." You are not claiming the floor through volume or aggression. You are claiming it through the most powerful authority signal in any interpersonal dynamic, the unshakable assumption that you deserve to be heard. The fifth and final principle in this chapter is what we will call the strategic close. The ability to end a high-stakes conversation in a way that cements your authority, rather than leaving it ambiguous. Most people let difficult conversations trail off. They end in an uncomfortable silence, or a vague mutual agreement to continue the discussion later, or a half-hearted resolution that satisfies nobody. The authoritative communicator closes with clarity. They name the conclusion. Here is where we have landed. They define the next step. Here's what happens next, and here is who is responsible for it. And they leave the interaction with their position clear, their intention stated, and the outcome defined. Because authority is not just about how you speak in the heat of the moment. It is about how you shape the meaning of the moment after it has passed. The person who defines what a conversation meant, who gives it its narrative, its conclusion, its forward direction, is the person who held the authority in that conversation, every single time. As Winston Churchill, a man who spoke with authority in the most genuinely high-stakes situations in modern history, once put it, "Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen." Authority under fire is the marriage of both the courage to hold your ground when it matters and the wisdom to receive what the moment is actually asking of you. In Chapter 7, we go somewhere that most books on authority and communication never go into the emotional dimension, into the kind of speaking that does not just inform people or persuade people, but moves people, activates them, changes what they feel at a level deep enough to change what they do. The chapter coming next is the one that separates speakers from leaders. Stay with me. Chapter 7. Emotional Authority. How to move people, not just inform them. There is a difference between a speaker who is remembered and a speaker who changes something. Most speakers are forgotten within 48 hours of the conversation ending, not because they were unintelligent, not because their information was wrong, not because they failed to prepare or failed to present themselves professionally. They are forgotten because they operated entirely on the informational level. They gave people things to think about, but never gave people anything to feel. And a human brain, which processes roughly 11 million bits of sensory information per second, but can only consciously handle around 40 of those bits at any given time, has a ruthless filing system for everything that passes through it. Information without emotional charge gets deprioritized, filed away in the vague, dim archive of things that were technically noted, but never truly received. But an experience that carries emotional charge, a moment of genuine resonance, a story that mirrors your own life back to you, a sentence that lands somewhere below your throat and above your stomach in the place where truth lives, that gets filed differently, that gets stored in a part of the brain that does not fade with time the way facts and figures do, that gets connected to identity, to memory, to the deep personal narrative through which every human being makes sense of their own life. And once something is connected to that narrative, it does not just inform, it transforms. This is emotional authority, and it is the difference between speaking well and speaking in a way that actually changes what people do, believe, and become after the conversation is over. Now, when most people hear the phrase emotional authority, they immediately think of one of two things. They think of the charismatic preacher who works a crowd into a frenzy through sheer force of performative passion, or they think of the manipulative salesperson who exploits psychological vulnerabilities to manufacture an emotional state that bypasses rational judgment. Both of these are real phenomena, and neither of them is what we are talking about here. Emotional authority, as we are defining it in this chapter, is not manipulation, and it is not performance. It is the deliberate, honest, skillful alignment of your communication with the emotional reality of the people you are speaking to. It is the ability to reach people where they actually live in their fears, their hopes, their frustrations, their deepest desires for their own lives, and to speak to those places directly, truthfully, and with enough precision that the listener feels, at a cellular level, that you understand them, that you see them, that what you are saying was made for exactly who they are and exactly where they are in their life right now. When that happens, the listener does not evaluate your message as an outside observer. They inhabit it. They bring their entire self to it. And a listener who has brought their entire self to your message is not just engaged, they are transformed. Because transformation does not happen at the information level. Transformation happens at the level of felt experience, and felt experience is the exclusive territory of emotional authority. So how do you build it? How do you develop the ability to move people rather than simply inform them? It begins with what we will call emotional intelligence in language specifically, the ability to identify the emotional subtext of any situation and address it directly rather than talking around it. Think about what happens in most professional conversations. Someone raises a concern in a meeting. The leader responds to the rational content of the concern, the data, the logic, the operational implications. But underneath the rational content of that concern, there was an emotional content that never got addressed. Maybe the person raising the concern was afraid of being made irrelevant by a new initiative. Maybe they were frustrated at feeling unheard in previous discussions. Maybe they were anxious about a change they didn't understand well enough to feel safe about. The rational response left all of that untouched, and so the person leaves the meeting with their concern technically answered, but emotionally unresolved. They will raise the same concern again in different language in the next meeting, and the one after that, because what was driving the concern was never addressed. The emotionally authoritative leader does something different. They hear the rational content, and they hear the emotional content simultaneously, and they respond to both. They say, "I hear what you are asking about the timeline, and I also want to acknowledge that this kind of change creates real uncertainty, and that uncertainty is uncomfortable. That is completely valid. Here is what I want you to know about where we are headed and why." That second sentence, the acknowledgement of the emotional reality, is what changes everything. The person who felt unheard suddenly feels heard. The person who was anxious suddenly feels safe enough to receive the information that follows. The wall comes down, and the message gets through. This is not soft communication. This is the most strategically effective communication available to any leader, in any organization, in any relationship that matters. The second element of emotional authority is storytelling, and not storytelling in the vague, general sense of telling anecdotes when you want to seem relatable. Storytelling as a precise psychological tool for creating the emotional experience that makes your message permanent rather than temporary. Here is the neuroscience behind why this matters so profoundly. When a listener hears a piece of information, a statistic, a fact, an argument, a logical chain of reasoning, a specific set of language processing regions in the brain activates. Those regions receive the information, process it, and store it with a certain level of priority. But when a listener hears a story, a narrative with characters, stakes, conflict, and resolution, something dramatically different happens. Multiple regions of the brain activate simultaneously. The sensory cortex activates, creating something close to a physical experience of the events being described. The emotional centers activate, creating a genuine feeling response to the characters and their situation. The motor cortex activates, creating a kinesthetic sense of the actions in the story. The listener is not receiving the story from outside. They are living it from inside. And the retention, the emotional impact, and the behavioral influence of information delivered in story form is not slightly higher than information delivered as abstract content. Research from Stanford University shows it is up to 22 times higher. 22 times. Let that number sit with you for a moment. This is why every great leader, every great teacher, every great communicator across every culture and every era in human history has been fundamentally a storyteller. Not because stories are entertaining, though they are, but because the story format is the native language of human meaning-making. The brain does not make sense of life through data. It makes sense of life through narrative. And when you speak in the language the brain uses to make meaning, the brain does not have to translate your message. It receives it directly. The third element of emotional authority is what we will call the honest expression of conviction. The willingness to let your own genuine emotional investment in your message be visible to your audience. This is where many professional communicators, particularly those trained in corporate or academic environments, consistently underperform. They have been taught, explicitly or implicitly, that professionalism requires emotional neutrality, that to be taken seriously you must be controlled, measured, and effectless, that showing passion is showing weakness. This is one of the most damaging lies in professional communication culture, because here is the psychological reality: emotion is contagious. not metaphorically contagious, literally, neurologically, physiologically contagious. The human brain contains a class of neurons called mirror neurons, whose specific function is to replicate, in the observer's own nervous system, the emotional and physical states they observe in others. When you watch someone cry, your own tear ducts activate slightly. When you watch someone laugh, your own face begins to mirror the expression. When you watch someone speak with genuine, visible, uncontrived passion about something they deeply believe in, your own nervous system begins to resonate with that passion. You feel it, not as an intellectual appreciation of their enthusiasm, but as a genuine emotional experience of your own. Which means your passion is not a distraction from your authority, it is a transmission of it. When you allow your genuine conviction to be visible in your voice, in your face, in the energy you bring to your words, you are not performing. You are activating the mirror neuron system of every person in your audience and inviting them to share the emotional state from which your message is being delivered. You are making them feel what you feel, and a listener who feels what you feel is not evaluating your message from a distance. They are inside it with you. Think about the late Steve Jobs unveiling a product he genuinely, visibly, almost childishly loved. The audience was not responding to the product alone. They were responding to the experience of watching a human being in a state of pure, unguarded excitement about something, and their mirror neurons were creating a version of that excitement in themselves. That excitement became associated with the product, and that association is worth more than any marketing budget ever assembled. As Aristotle wrote more than 2,000 years ago, in words that have never stopped being true, to perceive is to suffer, meaning the only way to truly reach another person is to make them feel something real. Information without emotion is data. Data is processed and filed. Emotion is experienced and remembered. And what is remembered is what changes lives. In Chapter 8, we confront the situations that destroy your emotional authority without warning, the moments when your nervous system hijacks your message mid-sentence and takes the whole conversation down with it. The argument that escalates beyond your intention, the nerves that arrive at exactly the wrong moment, the emotional triggers that bypass every technique you have learned and drag you into a reaction you will regret. Chapter 8 is where we build the armor. Stay with me. Chapter 8. When your nervous system hijacks your voice, reclaiming authority mid-storm. You have prepared. You have studied. You have practiced the breath, refined the voice, restructured the language, built the credibility, learned to move people emotionally, and walked into high-stakes rooms with your authority fully assembled and your presence fully intact. And then something happens. Someone says exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. A conversation takes a turn you did not see coming. A comment lands on a wound you forgot was still there. A person in the room looks at you in a specific way, uses a specific tone, or says a specific word, and something inside you shifts so fast and so completely that the version of yourself you spent weeks building simply vanishes. Your throat tightens. Your thoughts fragment. Your voice changes in ways you can hear but cannot stop. Your carefully constructed authority dissolves in real time in front of the exact people whose perception of you matters most. And the worst part is that you know it is happening. You can feel it happening, and you cannot stop it. This experience has a name. Neuroscientist Daniel Goleman, in his landmark work on emotional intelligence, called it the amygdala hijack. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, the ancient alarm system that has been protecting human beings from physical danger for millions of years, does not distinguish between a lion in the grass and a dismissive comment from your manager in a meeting. To the amygdala, a threat is a threat, and when it decides a threat is present, It does not consult your prefrontal cortex for a second opinion. It does not ask your carefully cultivated communication skills what the best response might be. It fires immediately, floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, and commandeers your entire behavioral system in service of one ancient, overwhelming priority: survive this. The problem is that survival behavior and authoritative communication behavior are almost perfectly opposed. Survival behavior is reactive, fast, loud, or frozen. Authoritative communication behavior is deliberate, measured, grounded, and clear. You cannot do both simultaneously, and in the moment of an amygdala hijack, survival behavior wins every time, unless you have built something specific, something deliberate, something practiced enough to intervene between the trigger and the reaction in a fraction of a second, where the choice actually lives. That intervention is what this entire chapter is about. Let's begin by understanding the trigger landscape, the specific categories of experience that most reliably hijack authority in communication, because you cannot defend against a threat you have not mapped. The first category is the personal attack or public dismissal. This is the moment when someone challenges not just your idea, but your competence, your credibility, or your right to be in the conversation at all. The comment that implies you don't know what you're talking about. The eye roll from a colleague when you make a point. The senior person in the room who interrupts you with something that carries the unmistakable subtext of "you are not important enough to be heard right now." These moments activate the amygdala with particular ferocity because they touch something deeper than the immediate conversation. They touch the ancient, universal human fear of being cast out, of losing your standing in the group, and the body responds to that fear with the same physiological intensity it would bring to a physical threat. The second category is the unexpected contradiction of your core position. The moment when you have committed publicly to an idea and someone presents evidence or an argument that genuinely challenges it. The amygdala reads this as a threat to identity, not just to the idea, because for most people, their positions and their opinions have become fused with their sense of self. An attack on the position feels like an attack on the person, and a reactive response, defensiveness, rigidity, escalating intensity, is the identity protecting itself rather than the intellect engaging with the challenge. The third category is accumulated emotional pressure, the hijack that does not come from a single triggering event, but from the slow accumulation of smaller frustrations, dismissals, and pressures over time, until the threshold is so low that a relatively minor event produces a disproportionately explosive response. This is the conversation that should have been manageable but wasn't, because it was carrying the weight of 10 previous conversations that never got resolved. This is the trigger that confuses everyone in the room, including you, because the intensity of the response seems completely disconnected from the size of the event that caused it. Understanding which category you are most vulnerable to is the first step toward building genuine resilience in high-pressure communication, because the intervention strategies, while sharing a common foundation, need to be calibrated to the specific nature of the hijack they are addressing. The foundation of every intervention strategy is what we will call the recognition pause, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The moment you feel the first physical signal of an amygdala activation, the chest tightening, the thoughts speeding up and fragmenting, the jaw clenching, the sudden heat behind the eyes, you pause. Not because you have nothing to say, not because you are conceding anything, but because you are making a conscious, deliberate decision to insert a gap between the stimulus and the response. And that gap, however small, is where your authority lives. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and built an entire philosophy of human resilience from that experience, articulated this principle with a precision that has never been surpassed. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Frankl was writing about survival under conditions of almost incomprehensible suffering, but the neurological principle he identified applies with equal force to every high-stakes communication moment you will ever face. The space between the trigger and the response is where your authority either holds or collapses. Expanding that space is the entire game. The recognition pause expands the space. It does this by activating the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that can override the amygdala's reactive commands, through the simple act of conscious attention. The moment you notice what is happening in your body and name it, even silently, "My amygdala is firing right now," this is a stress response. I am not in actual danger. You begin to reclaim the cognitive resources that the hijack was commandeering. The naming of the experience is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated neurological self-regulation tool available to a human being in real time. After the recognition pause comes the reset breath, a single, slow, deep, diaphragmatic breath that activates the vagus nerve, the body's primary parasympathetic pathway, and begins counteracting the physiological activation of the stress response. One breath, that is all. Not three, not five. One deliberate, grounding breath that says to your nervous system, we are not dying, we are in a conversation, and we are going to respond from our highest self. Now, from that slightly more regulated place, you deploy what we will call the precision response, a reply that addresses what was actually said rather than the emotional charge it carried. This requires a specific mental discipline that must be practiced before the high-pressure moment arrives, not improvised within it. The discipline is the ability to separate the content of a challenge from the emotional packaging it arrived in. Someone can deliver a valid point in an aggressive, dismissive, or condescending tone. The tone is not the point. The point is the point, and the authoritative communicator responds to the point clearly, directly, and without mirroring the emotional temperature of the delivery. This is extraordinarily difficult in practice. It requires a level of emotional regulation that most people do not naturally possess, and must therefore deliberately develop. But the development is not mysterious. It is repetitive. It is the practice of noticing in lower stakes conversations when emotional packaging is influencing your response to content. It is the deliberate exercise of separating the two in real time, conversation by conversation, until the separation becomes reflexive rather than effortful. The third specific tool for managing the hijack mid-conversation is strategic reframing, the ability to change the meaning of what just happened without denying that it happened. When someone dismisses your contribution in a meeting, the hijack brain reads that as a defeat. The regulated, authoritative brain reframes it as information about the other person's current state, their insecurities, their pressures, their limited perspective. Their reaction is about them. Your response is about you, and you control your response with a completeness that you will never control their reaction. Reframing is not denial. It is not the pretense that the dismissal did not sting. It is the conscious choice to assign a meaning to the event that serves your authority rather than undermining it. The dismissal becomes data rather than verdict. The challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of grounded, unshakable composure that authority under pressure actually requires. The final tool in this chapter is what we will call the recovery declaration, the ability to re-enter a conversation with full authority after a moment where you lost it. Because sometimes the hijack happens before you can stop it. Sometimes the reactive response escapes before the recognition pause could intervene. And the question then becomes not how to undo what happened. You cannot, but how to re-establish your authority in the moments that follow. The recovery declaration is simple, direct, and delivered with complete ownership. It sounds like, let me come back to that point, because I want to address it more clearly than I did a moment ago. Or, I want to restate my position on this because I don't think I expressed it as well as I should have. There is no groveling. There is no excessive apology. There is simply the clean, confident acknowledgement that you are going to give the conversation the quality of response it deserved from the beginning. And that kind of self-possessed recovery, the ability to acknowledge a stumble without being defined by it, is itself one of the most compelling demonstrations of authority you will ever produce. As Theodore Roosevelt, a man who fought battles of far greater consequence than any boardroom argument, once put it with characteristic directness, do what you can, with what you have, where you are. In the storm of an amygdala hijack, with the tools you now carry, in the exact conversation you find yourself in, you have everything you need to hold your authority. Not perfectly, but powerfully enough. In Chapter 9, we move beyond the individual conversation entirely. We zoom out to the long view, the architecture of a reputation for authority that builds itself over years, that precedes you into every room before you arrive, and that becomes the most valuable professional and personal asset you will ever own. Stay with me. Chapter 9. Belong Game Building. A reputation for authority that precedes you into every room. There is a version of authority that exists only in the moment you are performing it. It lives in the preparation, the breath work, the vocal technique, the language architecture, the emotional intelligence, all of the things we have built together across the previous 8 chapters. And every single one of those things matters enormously. Every single one of them will change your communication in ways that are immediate, measurable, and real. But there is a ceiling to what in the moment authority can achieve on its own. Because in the moment authority requires you to be present, it requires the performance to be active. The moment you leave the room, the moment the conversation ends, the moment the presentation is over, the authority you built in that specific interaction begins to fade from the memory of the people who witnessed it. Unless something else is already in place. Unless the room you walked into already had a story about you before you arrived. Unless the people in that meeting already carried a mental file labeled with your name, a file built from accumulated experiences, heard testimonials, witnessed consistency, and observed integrity over time, that predisposed them to receive everything you said with a baseline of respect that you did not have to earn from scratch in that room because you had already earned it somewhere else. That is the long game. That is the architecture of a reputation for authority. And it is the most powerful communication asset in existence, not because it makes you a better speaker in any single moment, but because it changes the conditions under which every future moment of communication takes place. A person with a strong reputation for authority does not walk into a room on neutral ground. They walk in on elevated ground. The room has already leaned in before they open their mouth. The credibility has already been deposited before the first word is spoken. The authority is not something they need to establish. It is something they merely need to maintain. So how do you build this? How do you construct, deliberately and systematically, a reputation that does this kind of work on your behalf? It begins with the principle of radical consistency, and this is the element that separates the people who occasionally speak with authority from the people who are known for it. Consistency is not glamorous. It does not produce the immediate dopamine reward of a single brilliant performance. It does not feel transformative on any given Tuesday when you are tired and the stakes are low and nobody important is watching. But consistency is the material from which reputation is built, because reputation is not formed by your best moments. Reputation is formed by the average of all your moments, by what people can reliably expect from you, not when everything is aligned in your favor, but when circumstances are ordinary, when you are under pressure, when there is nothing in the immediate environment rewarding you for bringing your best self. Think about the people in your professional life whose authority you most respect, the ones whose opinions carry weight in every room, whose credibility seems to precede them everywhere they go. Now think carefully about what they have in common. The answer, almost universally, is not that they are always the smartest person present. It is not that they always have the best idea, or the most data, or the most impressive credentials. The answer is that they are always the same person. They show up the same way in a casual hallway conversation as they do in a high-stakes board presentation. They speak with the same directness, the same honesty, the same considered care when nobody important is watching, as when the most important person in the organization is sitting across the table. Their consistency is so complete, so deeply ingrained, that it has become predictable. And in the psychology of trust, predictability is one of the highest forms of credibility a human being can offer another. Warren Buffett, who has built arguably the most trusted personal brand in American business history, has said something about this that every person building their reputation needs to understand completely. He said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you will do things differently. 20 years to build, 5 minutes to ruin." The asymmetry is stark, and it is real. And it means that reputation is not just something you construct, it is something you protect every single day, in every single interaction, including the ones that feel too small to matter. The second pillar of reputation building is what we will call the practice of deliberate visibility, and this is where many highly capable, deeply competent people consistently underinvest. Deliberate visibility is the intentional cultivation of opportunities to demonstrate your authority in contexts beyond your immediate daily environment. It is the willingness to speak up in the meeting, rather than letting your best insights remain private. It is the choice to volunteer for the high-profile project, even when the risk is real. It is the decision to put your perspective in writing in a thoughtful email, a shared document, a professional article in ways that allow your thinking to exist beyond the boundaries of any single conversation. Many people resist this. They feel that self-promotion is unseemly, that good work should speak for itself, that the quality of their contributions will eventually be recognized without any effort on their part to be seen. This is one of the most expensive beliefs a talented person can hold. Because organizations, relationships, and social systems do not automatically surface their best contributors. They surface their most visible contributors. Not because people are shallow or unfair, though sometimes they are, but because attention is finite and competition, for it is constant. The person who never makes their value visible is not being humble. They are being invisible. And invisible people do not build reputations. They accumulate frustration. Deliberate visibility is not the same as self-aggrandizement. It is not the breathless self-promotion of the person who announces their every achievement and talks over others to ensure their ideas get credited. It is the quiet, consistent practice of showing up in the rooms that matter, in the conversations that shape decisions, in the written and spoken forums where your field builds its shared understanding and contributing with the same quality, the same honesty, and the same authoritative presence that you bring to your best private moments. The third pillar is the cultivation of what sociologists call social capital, the network of relationships built on genuine mutual respect, trust, and reciprocal investment that amplifies your authority in every room you enter. Because reputation does not live inside you. It lives in other people. It lives in the stories they tell about you when you are not present. It lives in the recommendations they make, the introductions they offer, the endorsements they give when your name comes up in conversations you will never hear. And the quality of those stories is determined almost entirely by the quality of your investment in the relationships that produce them. Building social capital for authority is not networking in the transactional business card collecting sense that most people associate with that word. It is the long, slow, deeply human practice of being genuinely interested in the people around you, of listening to them with the same quality of attention you want them to bring to you, of following through on every commitment you make, no matter how small, of being the person who shows up not just when it is convenient or when there is something obvious to gain, but when the situation requires something and you are the person who can provide it. Maya Angelou's words from Chapter 5 echo here with particular force. People will forget what you said. They will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Every person who has left a conversation with you feeling genuinely heard, genuinely respected, genuinely seen carries a piece of your reputation in their nervous system. They will speak well of you, not because they made a conscious decision to promote your interests, but because their body remembers the experience of being in your presence and associates your name with something that felt good and real and trustworthy. The fourth pillar of reputation building is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, and it is the practice of public intellectual honesty, the willingness to change your position publicly, openly, and without defensiveness when new evidence or new understanding warrants it. In a culture that often rewards certainty and punishes the appearance of inconsistency, this can feel like a vulnerability. But in the long economy of reputation, the person who demonstrates that they think carefully enough to update their views, that their positions are held in service of truth rather than in service of ego, builds a form of credibility that rigid certainty can never produce. Abraham Lincoln changed his position on multiple issues over the course of his presidency as the weight of evidence and the gravity of circumstances demanded. He did not hide these changes. He explained them, honestly and publicly, in language that demonstrated the depth of his ongoing engagement with the questions at hand. And rather than diminishing his authority, these visible evolutions of thinking became part of the foundation of his historical legacy, because they told a story about a man who was more committed to getting things right than to appearing right. That story is one of the most authoritative stories a human being can tell. The fifth and final pillar of the long game is the investment in your own continued growth, the commitment to being, 6 months from now, a more capable, more knowledgeable, more emotionally intelligent communicator than you are today. Reputation is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain effortlessly. It is a living thing that requires continuous feeding. The leader who stopped growing 10 years ago is living on borrowed credibility, drawing down on a balance that is no longer being replenished. The person who is visibly, consistently, enthusiastically still learning, still reading, still seeking out perspectives that challenge their own, still willing to be the least informed person in the room when the room knows something they need to know, signals something to everyone around them that no single performance can ever signal alone. They signal that their best is still ahead of them. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in words that have defined the American spirit of self-determination for nearly 2 centuries, what lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Your reputation for authority is ultimately a reflection of what you are continuously building inside yourself. The conviction, the character, the consistency, and the commitment to speaking in a way that honors the potential of every conversation you are given. In Chapter 10, the final chapter, we do not summarize. We do not review. We arrive at something far more important than a recap of what you have already received. We arrive at the moment where everything you have learned in this audiobook meets the version of yourself that has been waiting to use it. The chapter coming next is not the end of this audiobook. It is the beginning of everything else. Stay with me. We are almost there. Chapter 10. The voice you were always meant to have now. Go use it. You make it here. Not just to the final chapter of this audiobook, but to the end of something much larger than a listening session. You made it through 9 chapters of deep, honest, sometimes uncomfortable truth about what it actually takes to speak with authority in a world that is constantly competing for attention, constantly rewarding the loudest voice over the most capable one, constantly filtering for signals of confidence before it ever evaluates the substance of what you have to say. You stayed. You listened. You engaged with every idea, every framework, every challenge this audiobook placed in front of you. And that tells me something important about you, something that the people in your life may not fully see yet, but that will become unmistakably visible in the weeks and months ahead. It tells me that you are not here for the performance of growth. You are here for the reality of it. Most people who encounter the ideas in this audiobook will nod along, feel motivated for a few hours, and then return to their existing patterns by Thursday. Not because they are lazy, not because they don't care, but because they treated the knowledge as an end in itself, rather than as the beginning of a practice. They received the information. They never made the decision. This chapter is about the decision. But before we get there, before we talk about what comes next, and what you are going to do differently, starting from this moment, we need to address something that does not belong in a summary. Because this is not a summary. It belongs in a reckoning. A direct, honest, eyes-open accounting of what has actually been holding your voice back. Not the surface-level habits we have addressed in the previous 9 chapters. Those were the symptoms. What we are talking about now is the root. The root for most people is a story they have been telling themselves for so long that it no longer feels like a story. It feels like a fact. The story has different words for different people, but its structure is almost always the same. It sounds like I am not the kind of person who commands a room. It sounds like people like me don't get listened to the way that other people do. It sounds like I have tried to speak with more confidence before, and it never felt natural. So maybe this just isn't who I am. That story, that deeply ingrained, emotionally protected, constantly reinforced narrative about the limits of your voice, is not a fact. It is a conclusion you drew from incomplete evidence at a time in your life when you did not yet have the tools to interpret the evidence correctly. You were not born with a voice that doesn't deserve to be heard. You were trained by specific environments, specific experiences, and specific people to believe that the authority you naturally carry is either too much or not enough. And you have been shrinking or overcompensating ever since trying to find a version of your voice that the world around you would accept, rather than developing the version of your voice that the world around you actually needs. Let that land fully, because it changes everything about what comes next. The work of the previous 9 chapters has given you the technical foundation, the body, the breath, the voice, the language, the credibility, the emotional authority, the resilience under pressure, the long game of reputation. All of that is real and all of it is yours. But technical foundation without identity shift is a house built on sand. You can learn every vocal technique in existence and still walk into a room carrying the story that your voice doesn't belong there, and the story will win every single time. Because the human system is extraordinarily consistent at producing outcomes that match its deepest beliefs about itself. So the first and most fundamental act of this final chapter is this: you need to consciously, deliberately, and permanently retire the story that your authority is conditional, that it depends on how the room receives you, that it requires external validation to be real, that it is something you are allowed to have only after enough people have confirmed that you deserve it. Your authority is not conditional. It never was. It was always there in the quality of your thinking, in the depth of your care for the people you communicate with, in the genuine conviction you carry about the things that matter to you. What was missing was not the authority itself. What was missing was the permission you gave yourself to express it, and that permission, that final, irreversible, non-negotiable green light you give yourself to show up fully in every conversation, every room, every interaction that matters, is not something anyone else can give you. Not a mentor, not a manager, not a spouse, not a self-help book, not even this audiobook. That permission is yours to grant. And the only question is whether you are going to grant it today, or continue waiting for a level of external validation that, by definition, cannot arrive until after you have already started showing up as if you deserve it. Consider the journey of Oprah Winfrey, a woman who grew up in rural poverty in Mississippi, who was told explicitly and repeatedly by the environment she moved through that her voice was too much, too emotional, who was literally demoted from her first television news job because a producer decided she was too emotionally invested in her stories. Oprah did not wait for the industry to change its mind about her before she started using her voice with full authority. She made a decision about who she was, about what her voice was worth, about the absolute non-negotiability of her authentic presence, and she brought that decision into every room she entered from that point forward. The world did not give Oprah Winfrey her authority. Oprah Winfrey gave herself her authority, and then she showed up so consistently, so powerfully, and so authentically in possession of it that the world had no rational choice but to agree. That is the model, not the celebrity, not the scale, the sequence. Decision first, evidence second. The world confirms what you have already committed to. It does not give you permission to commit. Now let's talk about what this looks like practically, because transformation without practical application is just inspiration, and inspiration without action has a half-life of approximately 72 hours. Starting from the next conversation, you have not the next important one, not the next high-stakes one, but the very next one, however ordinary it may seem. You are going to bring everything. The grounded breath before you speak, the deliberate pace, the eye contact that says you are fully present, the sentence structures that lead with conviction rather than hedging toward it, the willingness to pause without filling the silence with anxiety, the emotional honesty that lets people feel what you feel rather than just hear what you think. All of it in the ordinary conversation. Because authority is not a costume you put on for special occasions. It is a practice you build through the relentless repetition of ordinary moments treated as if they matter, because they do. Every conversation is a rehearsal for every future conversation. Every time you choose the grounded breath over the anxious rush, you are rewiring a neural pathway. Every time you complete a thought without hedging it into meaninglessness, you are building the muscle. Every time you hold eye contact for 1 second longer than is comfortable, you are expanding your tolerance for the kind of visible presence that authority requires. The transformation is not coming. The transformation is happening right now, in this moment. in the decision you are making about what kind of communicator you are going to be from this point forward. There is one final thing this audiobook needs to say to you, and it is not a technique, not a framework, not a strategy. It is a reminder of something you already know but may have forgotten somewhere along the way of being told your voice was too much or not enough. The world desperately needs people who can speak with authority, not the hollow authority of titles and volume and rehearsed charisma, the real authority of genuine conviction, emotional honesty, intellectual courage, and a settled, unshakable belief that what you have to say matters. The world is full of noise, an overwhelming, relentless cascade of voices competing for attention, manufacturing urgency, performing confidence they do not feel in service of outcomes that do not serve the people listening to them. Into that noise, a voice like the one you are building, grounded, credible, emotionally real, architecturally sound, resilient under pressure, consistent over time, does not just stand out. It stands as a landmark. It becomes the voice people remember, the voice people seek out, the voice people follow, not because it is the loudest, but because it is the most trustworthy, because it has never asked for more than it deserved, and has never given less than everything it had. As the great poet and civil rights activist Audre Lorde wrote in words that should live permanently in every communicator's consciousness, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. The fear does not have to go away before you start. The authority does not have to be perfect before you use it. The permission does not have to come from anywhere outside of you before you begin. You have the body, you have the voice, you have the language, you have the credibility, you have the emotional intelligence, you have the resilience, you have the long game. And now, if you are willing to retire the story that was never true in the first place, you have the identity to carry all of it into every room, every conversation, and every relationship that your life is going to ask you to show up for." This is not the end of this audiobook. This is the beginning of the version of you that speaks, and a room goes quiet, and every head turns, and people lean in because they can feel, before you have said a word, that what is coming is worth every second of their full, undivided, completely willing attention. Your voice was always worth that. You just needed to believe it first. Now go speak.